Lisa Wool-Rim Sjöblom, who is going to talk about LGBTQ plus surrogacy and the rights of children. And Lisa, who uses she, her as pronouns, is a Korean-Swedish comic book artist, illustrator, and adoptee rights activist. She has published several children's books and the graphic novel Palimpsest, which takes a deeper look into the dark side of the adoption industry. So welcome, Lisa. Thanks for being here with us. We're gonna have 30 minutes of talk and an additional 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So people in the audience, feel free to write like simple and clear questions using the chat, and then we're going to anonymously read it in the end. So let's start, Lisa. Welcome.
Lisa, you're on mute. Oh.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead. Carry on.
Yeah. Tina Kausu Katwa. This talk is given to you from Aotearoa on stolen indigenous land. And before I begin, I'd like to show my support for Tina Rangatiritanga and Mana Motuake for Tangata Whenua. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. My name is Lisa Wool-Rim Sjöblom, and I'm a Swedish-Korean comic book artist, illustrator, and adoptee rights activist. And I want to start by apologizing, but I need to read my papers because I'm speaking in English, which is not my first language, and I can get a bit insecure. So I will be reading from a manuscript, so I don't lose focus and forget what I'm supposed to say. So I hope this is okay. I'll try to not be too focused on my papers. But yeah, and as an adoptee rights activist, I fight for justice for adoptees and first families who have been separated by adoption. And my activist consists of several things. I'm part of a network of Korean adoptees who hold workshops, and we organize lectures and demonstrations. We raise money for single mothers. We publish information about how to search for first families. We do film screenings, and we share knowledge and expertise with politicians and other government bodies. So we do a great deal of things. And I also have an Instagram account that I use as a platform for activism, where I inform my followers about issues relating to transracial and transnational adoption. And I do this from a decolonized, feminist, and anti-racist point of view. I've also, like Angie mentioned, published a graphic novel called Palimpsest, in which I tell the story of my search for my Korean family and how I learned that my adoption was based on false paperwork and corruption. I also want to let you know that I identify as queer, and I have been part of the LGBTQ movement since I was a teenager. But a lot of things have changed since I joined it, yeah. And today I will talk to you about surrogacy, commercial as well as non-commercial, from a child-centered point of view. And I will approach this not as an academic researcher, and not as a lawyer or a lawmaker, but as an adoptee and an activist who spent many years exchanging stories, perspectives, and life experiences with those affected by alternative reproductive methods, and whose rights, feelings, and opinions tend to be the most overlooked, which I find a bit ironic. I have personal experience of being relinquished as a newborn baby, and of having my records altered and manipulated. I also have experience of searching for my origins and dealing with the agencies that profited from me being separated from my mother. I know what it's like to find receipts and confirmation of payments that my parents did in order to become my parents. And I actually realize now that I should have called this talk An Adoptee's Guide to Surrogacy, because I will talk quite a lot about adoption too, and not just surrogacy. I think that there are even though there are a lot of significant differences between adoption and surrogacy, I also think that there are a lot of aspects of adoption that are relevant to surrogacy. Adoption, just like surrogacy, is often described as progressive, as feminist, as radical, as equalizing, and LGBTQ friendly. An LGBTQ friendly way of forming a family. even though it's part of a billion-dollar industry that favors the needs of wealthy, straight, white, middle-class couples in the global West. And with this talk, I hope I can shed a little bit more light on what the consequences can be when alternative reproduction is favoring an adult-centered view rather than a child-centered one. In this talk, I will be using the term surrogate parent to describe the person who is asked or contracted to go through IVF, get pregnant, carry the baby or babies, give birth, and hand over the baby post-birth. I use this term to acknowledge the fact that not just women carry babies and that not all surrogate parents identify as women. But I think it's quite important to keep in mind that the majority of people who act as surrogates are in fact women, and they are usually poor and of color. This means that surrogacy is also deeply intertwined with matters of race, class, and gender. I don't want to use any of the depersonalizing terms that are becoming more and more established within the language of surrogacy, as I find that they deny the fact that surrogate parents play an incredibly intimate and life-dependent role whilst carrying the baby than this practice want to acknowledge. The child in utero is actually biologically linked to the surrogate parent regardless of contracts and lacks of genetic links. I also want to acknowledge that the vast majority who uses surrogate arrangements are heterosexual married couples. But for this talk, I was asked to place the discussion in an LGBTQ context, but anything I bring up revolving the rights of children applies to any surrogacy agreement, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, or marital status of the commissioning party. I assume that most of you who are listening know what surrogacy is, but I will give a very brief description for those who may not. So surrogacy is a form of assisted reproduction where the commissioning party, that is the intended parents, get a child from a surrogate parent who has been impregnated with an embryo and hands over the baby post-birth. The child can be genetically related to both the commissioning parents, just one or neither. When the genetic material comes from someone other than the commissioning party, there has very often been a financial transaction involved to acquire the eggs and sperm. I will not dwell too much on this though, but I do want to say that I'm aware that third-party provision of genetic material comes with its own particular set of issues that also can and sometimes do violate the rights of children. And more people who have been conceived in such a way are raising their voices in opposition. I also think it's good to know that the European Parliament condemns all forms of surrogacy, as they see it as a reproductive exploitation where the human body is used for financial and other gains, and that it mainly targets vulnerable women in developing countries. So, not long ago, some of my friends was celebrating the decision that one state in the United States had decided to let 2 lesbian adoptive mothers be put on the adopted child's birth certificates. My friends talked about this as a victory for LGBTQ rights and a step forward in recognizing that adoptive parents are real parents. This was about equality, and it was a win, they thought. The fact that the ruling altered the child's birth story and denied the child their origins, it didn't really matter to them. And I think that this is not just symptomatic for adoption, but surrogacy as well, regardless of people's opinions about it. Even if people are against surrogacy, they can still be, yeah. The discourse is almost always adult-centered, no matter what side we take in this issue. And this is a bit ironic because the whole business is actually about acquiring a child. As an adoptee rights activist, I'm quite used to being asked to be understanding of those who adopt or wish to. I'm asked to consider the feelings and understand the pain of infertility and childlessness. And the same goes for surrogacy. As an adoptee, I'm expected to be grateful and in support of adoption as an alternative reproductive method. I'm supposed to feel that being alive is so important that my rights and needs don't matter. And this, instead of being met with compassion when I talk about how we are constantly overlooked and how many of us are suffering in secret. I'm told that I'm hateful and angry and even against love. But those of us who are fighting for children's rights when it comes to adoption and all these other new alternative methods of reproduction, we do so because there are conventions, laws, research, and lived experiences that back us up. We know the severity of not being seen or heard and having our voices silenced. And here it's important to point out that it's actually not about the parents, because many of us grow up with perfectly wonderful, loving, and caring parents who have no other intention than to have a child and just love it. So the question then is, why do we still suffer? Why are so many of us deeply unhappy? Why do so many of us try to take our lives? And why are so many of us already dead? You may not be familiar with this, but adoptees are actually overrepresented when it comes to suicidal attempts and death by suicide. Many of us also struggle with various kinds of addictions, self-destructive behavior, physical pains, criminality, and several psychological problems. And this is because adoption and surrogacy are also stories about loss, grief, and unbearable pain. Or rather, that is actually how our lives start and what our families are built on. For adoption and surrogacy to happen, the child is required to lose their first family. And since the demand for children is significantly higher than the number of children available, both industries are ridden with corruption and abusive practices that put the needs and wishes of the commissioning parents first. Too often, children are reduced to commodities, and their inherent rights, as granted them in the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child, are denied. As we are short of time, I won't go through all the relevant articles in the convention, but I want to mention some of them briefly. And I highly recommend to anyone interested to read it thoroughly, because it's really good. And also just point out that the UK signed the convention in 1990 and ratified it the following year. And as a ratifying state, all things involving children must be about the best interest of the child. So there are some rights that I keep coming back to in my work in activism. And these are the rights that are often denied us, and also the ones that so many of us are fighting for. Sadly, though, the convention sometimes actually works in favor of the industry, because many of us are already adults when we realize that a lot of our rights were taken away from us when we were children. But as adults, these rights, we are no longer entitled to them. Some of these rights are, for instance, the right to be registered immediately after birth and the right to nationality. And this is one of the things that we can see that that is a struggle in surrogacy, that a lot of children are left stateless when parents travel overseas to have a baby. Another point is the right to know about the origins and the right to preserve our family relations. And this relates, among other things, to genetics and biology, some of the things that we also very often denied in both adoption and surrogacy. And also Article 35, which says that state parties shall take the appropriate measures to prevent the sale of children for any purpose or in any form. Just like with the adoption industry, there are those who are now selling the idea of surrogacy as ethical and as a win-win situation. And they talk a lot about how the surrogate mothers or surrogate parents are doing this because they want to give the gift of a child, and they're doing this selflessly. But make no mistake, sooner or later we will learn that at least some of these arrangements were built on coercion, exploitation, lies, and deceit. And the children produced from this will learn the truth and bear the consequences. And just like with the adoption industry, those who have gained from it will blame those of us who are uncovering the truth and claim that we are the ones who are causing harm. So like I said in the beginning, I think that there's a lot of things that adoptees can teach you about children born from surrogacy arrangements. And one of the important things that we can take with us from the adoption world is that it may take many, many years before children born from surrogacy today will start to speak up. At the beginning of modern adoptions, most research was carried out by our parents or adoptive parents or people who worked with adoption. Studies about adopted children were based on interviews with our parents, and many of the things that adult adoptees are questioning now were not found in these studies. And problems that were detected were often explained in such a way that they wouldn't actually threaten the adoption project as such. Today, when research is also done by adoptees and many of us have reached middle age, the view of adoption has broadened and include far more perspectives than earlier. And I want to bring attention to some of the things that we know a little bit more about today. For instance, the trauma of postnatal or early childhood relinquishment. The baby in the womb doesn't know that the surrogate parent is not the intended parent, nor does the baby know that they may not be genetically related to the surrogate parent. Research shows that babies favor the person who has carried them, and that they also recognize their smell and their voices and are calmed by these. The breast milk that is produced is designed specifically for the baby, and it changes as the baby grows to continue to meet the baby's needs. And as addiction counselor Paul Sunderland, who is a very important voice to many, many adoptees, he says, there can be no relinquishment without trauma. And in his talks, which you can find on YouTube, for instance, and I highly recommend them, Sunderland brings up the fact that adoptees or people who have been subjected to early childhood relinquishment are overrepresented in treatment. He describes the separation as an enormous grief and a life-threatening sensation for the baby, who is being taken from the only person they have ever known. Even when the baby is returned to the first parent, the separation may be damaging, as have been found with babies who have spent times in incubators straight after birth, for instance. Another thing is the damaging secrecy surrounding how we came to our families. Some children may have their birth certificates altered and may not be told that they were actually born from a surrogate parent, or that they may not be genetically related to one or none of their parents. Or some may only learn later in life and feel enormous grief then that they have been, or feel that they've been deceived. Another thing that can cause a lot of anxiety is anonymity when it comes to family ties and not knowing anyone in your genetic family. And one thing that a lot of us are talking about is the fear of incest, for instance. Even though we are told that this is highly unlikely, in many countries, they don't actually regulate the number of children that can be conceived from the same donor. So some people have actually learned that they have hundreds of half siblings that they don't know who they are. And another thing is the denial of access to records, family history, genetic and medical history. And this can actually pose a health risk to not have knowledge about your genetic history. Also, not knowing where you come from can be incredibly painful and triggering when everyone around you knows who they are. This may cause the child to feel like an outsider. Finally, your placement in the family may be part of a for-profit industry where someone or several people have made money from your birth. And critical adoptees have been told for a long time not to see adoption as the sale in children. We are told that our parents pay money for the adoption, not for us. But it doesn't matter that the adoption by definition means getting a child. The same goes for surrogacy, where the argument is that one is merely renting a uterus, not purchasing a baby. But what is the uterus for? To get a baby. The uterus without the production of a baby is worth nothing in a surrogacy arrangement. It's just like an adoption fee without a child. No matter how the adult parties involved choose to define this, the child may feel very different about it, and we need to respect that. One thing I like to do when I give these talks is to turn adoptee struggles into questions that I direct to the surrogacy industry. These questions reveal many of the things that adoptees deal with, and many of the things that we don't usually get to hear, since the dominant adoption narrative still tend to focus on positive aspects. I'm confident that several of these questions will mirror the experiences of many of those who are born from surrogacy today, and some of them have already started happening. So here goes. Will children born from surrogacy be shamed and ridiculed for wanting to know where they come from? Will they be labeled as angry, sick, hateful, and ungrateful? Will they learn to hide negative emotions and only show positive emotions they know they'll be rewarded for? And I think that separation trauma plays a big part here, because if there's something we learn or something that we fear is to be abandoned by our parents, so we do what we think will please them. Will children of surrogacy be pinned against other children of surrogacy, where those who celebrate surrogacy will be welcomed and held up as poster children, and those who feel less about it will be left out in the cold? This is the harsh reality for many adoptees who find that they are not welcome in adoption groups and circles, since their views and emotions are considered wrong. So-called happy adoptees learn to hate those who are struggling and who are critical, and vice versa. Will they be used in advertising to promote their families even when they are far too young to understand what they're promoting? Will they be scripted and filmed for social media to say things that basically mean that they are dismissing their own rights? Will they wonder what other genetic and biological siblings they may have? And as I mentioned earlier, will they, like adoptees, worry about falling in love or sleep with someone closely related to them? How will they deal with their parents' biological and or other genetically linked children? Will they feel that their lives are conditioned? Will they feel alienated and different? Will they be told that they are more special, more chosen, and more loved than other children when they question the methods that brought them to their family? Will they be told to be grateful for having been born at all if they express criticism? Will they also be denied to search for their roots and origins? Will the surrogacy agencies also claim that there was a fire in the archive when they try to find who they were born from? Will their searches be ridden with obstacles, insane fees, and authority figures who will question their needs for answers? Will the parents answer for them when they get questions about their physical and mental health? Will the majority of the research into their well-being, thoughts, and feelings be carried out by their parents and other people who benefit from surrogacy arrangements? Will literature about surrogacy be written mainly by their parents? Will they be patronized or ridiculed when seeking help and told that their struggles are imaginary? Will their search for origins and biological families be turned into popular entertainment? Will they be constantly asked about what their parents feel when they express their thoughts and opinions on surrogacy, when they ask questions about their beginnings, or when they want to search for genetic and biological family members? Will some companies try to profit from the further needs of surrogate children? Will they one day learn that what has been presented to them as ethical, equal, and voluntary when it comes to the surrogate parents was actually based on corruption, coercion, financial pressure, and a number of other unethical methods that people use to make vulnerable people sell their reproductive functions? And I'm thinking here about what's going on in Chile at the moment, for instance. There's a huge crime investigation going on there where the government is looking into thousands and thousands of adoptions that were carried out during the Pinochet era. And the adoptions were, the adopted parents were given papers that looked perfectly correct, where the child's history is that the parent was young or unmarried or sick or in any sort of situation where they couldn't keep the child. So they voluntarily gave up the child for adoption and hoping that the child could get a better life in, for instance, Sweden. And then now, many, many years later, we learn that the mothers were actually lost the babies to kidnappers, or they were told at the hospital after birth that the children had died. And then they were illegally moved out of the country and sold for adoption to Swedish couples. So this is a reality, but the parents didn't know then, and they thought that they were involved in something ethical that later turned out to be absolutely awful. And finally, will they feel that they have to wait until their parents have died to be able to express what they really feel? I don't think that surrogacy should ever be treated as something that anyone is entitled to. And I find it deeply disturbing that critique against surrogacy is more and more often labeled as homophobia or wanting to deny LGBTQ people the opportunity to form a family. Not only is surrogacy only for the wealthy few, or the few who happen to know someone willing to carry and relinquish a baby to them for free. It's also a form of reproduction that requires the infliction of trauma onto a newborn baby. As LGBTQ people, we should have the right not to be discriminated against when it comes to our roles as parents or caregivers, but that doesn't mean that we have the right to a child. Children have their own rights, and just like us adults, they deserve to be treated with dignity. They should not be for us to design, buy, sell, relinquish, and receive as we like. I mean, we don't want to be treated like that. So why should we accept that kind of treatment when it comes to children? Is it because we think that they are so small that they won't know what's being done to them? I also like to point out the fact that in several of the countries that people turn to for surrogacy arrangements, LGBTQ people are still fighting for the basic rights. They may not, for instance, be allowed to marry, civil partnerships may not be recognized, and they may not be allowed to either adopt or turn to surrogacy to form a family themselves. In many, if not most cases, surrogate parents are required to lead heterosexual lives, be married, and have given birth to their own children. How can surrogacy then be depicted as a progressive and LGBTQ-friendly way to form a family when it's realized through people who themselves are kept in patriarchal, heteronormative family structures? I don't have any clear answers, unfortunately, to how states can formulate a legal framework that sides with all interest when it comes to alternative reproduction. But one thing that I find should be possible is co-parenting. I think that our states could and should recognize more parents or guardians than two, and make it easier for people to jointly have babies, where the child has access to their family origins and don't need to start their life with a traumatizing separation. We could find ways to include the surrogate parents and those who have supplied the genetic material so that the child doesn't need to suffer loss at the very beginning of their lives. I think we need to talk about child-centered conception more, and where the best interest of the child is put first and foremost. And I believe that we need to continue this discussion and find other ways to build LGBTQ families that by design don't endanger the rights and needs of our most vulnerable individuals. I would love a future where people don't automatically assume that being LGBTQ means not being able to have a family at all. I mean, not being able to have children at all, or where adoption and surrogacy are presented as the only alternatives. I also believe that there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to the idea of the nuclear family structure as the only valid one, as it tends to be here in the West. There are cultures where co-parenting is the norm and where the extended family is as important as the parent-child relationship. Children get to grow up with several caretakers, but this is not dependent on the severance of origins and roots or early childhood relinquishment. So let's continue this discussion and work towards better ways to build our families. And that's all I have to say. So I'd like to thank QTI Coalition of Colour for inviting me to speak, and all of you who've listened. And I think we're opening for questions now.